Joining us now here in studio is Congressman John Boehner for his first Sunday show interview since being elected Speaker of the House. And Mr. Speaker, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Chris, good to be with you.
Should our government continue to back Egyptian President Mubarak, and what about the $1.5 billion in U.S. aid to that country?
Well, I think the administration, our administration so far, has handled this tense situation pretty well. Clearly, reforms need to occur in Egypt. And frankly, any place around the world where people are calling out for freedom and democracy, I think we have a responsibility to respond. And I think listening to the Egyptian people, working with the government to bring more democratic reforms is all in the right direction.
The dilemma, of course, is if Mubarak were to suddenly go, that the Islamic radicals could potentially take over. The head of the House Republican Policy Committee, Thaddeus McCotter, a Republican congressman, said this: America must stand with her ally Egypt to preserve an imperfect government capable of reform and prevent a tyrannical government capable of harm. Is that GOP policy?
I believe that Mr. McCotter said it exactly right. What we don't want are radical ideologies to take control of a very large and important country in the Middle East.
So we have to stand by Mubarak under those circumstances.
I think what we need to do, there are legitimate grievances that the Egyptian people have, and they need to be addressed. And whether that's through free and fair elections, whether it's through more democratic reforms in the short term, I think all of these, again, are moving in the right direction.
On Tuesday, we watched you sitting behind the president during the State of the Union. A lot of us wonder, what is he thinking while this is going on? Can you accept the increases in spending for education and research and infrastructure that the president called for as part of an overall spending cut?
Chris, the President of the United States is asking us to increase the debt limit. But on Tuesday night, he didn't even address it. And I don't think the American people will tolerate increasing the debt limit without serious reductions in spending and changes to the budget process so that we can make sure that this never happens again. The other night, all he did was call for more stimulus spending. I think our team's been listening to the American people. They want us to reduce spending, and there's no limit to the amount of spending that we're willing to cut.
So all of the president's so-called investments are unacceptable as far as you're concerned?
The American people want us to cut spending. They don't want more stimulus spending.
Let's talk about spending, because you and House Republicans say you want to cut non-defense discretionary spending all the way back to 2008 levels. This year, according to the White House, a 20% cut, and let's put this up on the screen, means that 200,000 kids would be dropped from Head Start, the FBI would cut 2,700 agents, and the government would detain thousands fewer illegal immigrants. Question: do you support those kinds of program cuts?
No, and neither do my colleagues. And if you wanted to do an across-the-board cut, that's what you would have. But, you know, we started on the first day of this Congress by cutting Congress's own budget. I cut my leadership budget. All the leadership budgets were cut. Committee budgets were cut. And all members' office budgets were cut. We followed that up with weekly cuts on the House floor, including this past week when we eliminated taxpayer funding of presidential elections. We also voted to repeal the job-killing health care bill, which will save us $2.6 trillion in spending over the next 10 years and avoid a $700 billion tax increase. We've also called, in our pledge to America, to end all TARP spending, eliminate all excess stimulus spending that still may be out there, and why don't we get the federal government out of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and save billions in the process?
So what you're saying is that you're going to target your cuts, that some programs won't be cut and others will be cut more than the 20%.
I expect that's what the committee will do.
And for instance, are you saying that Head Start and the FBI and programs to enforce immigration would be
Chris,
off the board, off the table?
The committee will make these decisions. In the next 10 days or so, I expect that we'll see the product of the Appropriations Committee. It will come to the floor of the House the week of February 14th, as outlined by the majority leader. And the House will be able to consider this continuing resolution to fund our government under an open process. Some may want to cut more, some may want to cut less. But I'm going to allow the House to work its will because I think listening to the American people, the House will, in fact, respond with significant cuts in spending.
Let's look at the calendar, which you have just talked about, because the continuing resolution does run out. The resolution funding the government runs out on March 4th. By the end of March, we may reach the debt ceiling of $14 trillion. How do you plan to do this? Because to a certain degree, they both involve the same thing, which is that in return for these things, continue funding the government and to raise the debt limit, you want funding cuts, spending cuts. Are you going to deal with them both at the same time? Are you going to deal with them separately? How do you see that playing out?
We expect to deal with these as separate questions. I think these are two opportunities that Congress has to deal with the administration to cut spending. And if the administration's been listening, as we have to the American people, I would expect they will join us in reducing spending here in Washington, D.C.
But how do you resolve your differences with the president? These are two very important issues here. One is you could run out of money for the government. The other is that we might default on our full faith and credit. How do you resolve your differences with the president where he wants a freeze and you want sharp cuts in spending?
The American people will not tolerate our increasing the debt limit without serious reductions in spending. And they're not going to allow us to move ahead if we don't put real budget controls in place so that this can't happen again. It's time for us to get serious. The American people on Election Day made it clear they want us to cut spending and they want us to create jobs. And what we have to understand is that cutting spending will, in fact, help create jobs in America.
So are you saying basically you want unconditional surrender from the White House?
We want to reduce spending.
And
period.
And there's no compromise?
We want to reduce spending. I hope that's what the American people want. I hope the president and his advisors are listening to the American people.
I mean, there's an implied or else in all of this. Because if you're not willing to compromise... Let me finish the question, Mr. Speaker. If you're not willing to compromise, then the government could shut down. If you're not willing to compromise, and I'm not saying it's your fault or the president's, but we could default on our debt.
Well, we have to work our will in the House. We have to work with our colleagues in the Senate and put something on the president's desk. But I'm going to suggest to you that we're going to keep our word to the American people, that we will, in fact, reduce wasteful Washington spending.
I want to... I know you're not threatening to default, but do you agree with administration officials and other economists that defaulting on the full faith and credit of the United States would be a financial disaster?
That would be a financial disaster not only for our country, but for the worldwide economy. So remember, the American people on Election Day said we want to cut spending and we want to create jobs. And you can't create jobs if you default on the federal debt. Listen, there's been a spending spree going on in Washington these last couple of years that's beyond control. And if the president's going to ask us to increase the debt limit, then he's going to have to be willing to cut up the credit cards. We've got to work together by listening to the American people and reducing these obligations that we have.
So defaulting on the full faith and credit is unacceptable to you?
I don't think it's a question that's even on the table.
You mentioned earlier that if you cut spending, that will increase jobs. There are a lot of economists, including some conservatives, who say, yes, in the long term, we absolutely have to deal with the debt, but that in the short term, to have the kind of cuts you have will actually cost jobs and could conceivably endanger the recovery.
No, I've got 200 economists who say otherwise. And the fact is this, is that by running up the spending money we don't have, running up these huge budget deficits, we create more uncertainty in the private sector. And this is where cutting spending will create jobs because it's going to bring greater fiscal responsibility here in Washington, D.C., and some of the uncertainty and allow jobs to be created in America.
Now, we had the Tea Party faction in the House, the Republican Study Committee, which has called for even bigger cuts, not to 2008 levels, but 2006 levels. They talk about cutting $2.5 trillion of debt over the next decade. Michelle Bachmann, who made her own separate reaction. Do you see any problem dealing with the Tea Party faction inside the House Republican caucus?
Absolutely not. We all got elected in November, all 435 members of the House. We all heard what our voters had to say. Cut spending, create jobs. And the fact is that our spending resolution, where we instructed the Appropriations Committee to come back to the House, that we voted on this past week, said bring us back at 2008 levels, pre-stimulus, pre-bailout levels, or less. So we'll see what the committee has to bring to the floor. And then again, we're going to allow members from both sides of the aisle to offer their amendments. And we'll allow the House to work its will. I can't predict what the House will or won't do, but I clearly have some members who want to go further than what some others want to do.
But are there some spending cuts that are too much, that go too far?
We'll allow the House to work its will. You know, I'm the Speaker of the House, the Speaker of the whole House. My job is not to do what's been done in the past, and that's to dictate what members will get to vote on. We want to allow the House to work its will, and we will.
Of course, as Willie Sutton would have said, the real money is in entitlements. You met with several of us reporters the day of the State of the Union speech, and you made it clear that you are not going to go first in terms of proposing entitlement reforms and let Democrats then demagogue whatever it is you say. The White House, I got to tell you, because I've been talking to some officials there, says exactly the same thing. They don't want to go first and let you guys demagogue them. So if both sides are doing this Alphonse and Gaston act and waiting for the other side, how does it get done?
Listen, I've made it real clear that I think it's time for Washington to have an adult conversation with the American people about the big challenges that face us. And frankly, I think the White House is interested in having that same conversation. But here we've got the Senate Majority Leader who says there's no problem in Social Security. And if we can't get Senate Democrats and their leader to recognize that we've got real problems, I don't know how we begin to move down this path of having this adult conversation that I'd like to have, and I frankly think the President would like to have.
So, but in the end, does it mean that you and the President and all the leaders are going to have to get together and get into the boat at the same time?
I think that is the responsible way to address big problems that face our country. We've been into this gotcha politics around this town for far too long. And the American people want us to look them in the eye and say, this is how big the problem is. And I think that that conversation has to happen. Once that happens, then we can begin to talk about an array of possible solutions. And out of that conversation, then begin to develop a plan of what's doable to address the long-term concerns that we have in these entitlement programs.
What do you think are the chances of a deal on entitlements in, at least even a partial deal, in the 6 to 8 months that you say we have before everybody goes into campaign mode?
I'm an optimist. I'll be the first one to admit it. And I'm hopeful that we can begin this conversation and to make real progress to address our long-term concerns. We can't continue to go down the path that we've been on. And I think the American people are ready for this conversation. They're expecting us to lead. And I'm hopeful that working across the aisle and working with the White House, we can, in fact, begin the conversation.
Would you be willing to accept not only benefit cuts to entitlements, but also revenue increases?
Now here you're getting right into the same old nonsense that we've always gotten into.
It's not nonsense. These are the issues.
Let's talk about the size of the problem.
Well, we know it's a bad problem.
Then once the American people have their arms around how big the problem is, then, and only then, should we begin to talk about an array of possible solutions.
After the election, and you just talked about the fact that you and the President and all the leaders need to get in the room together and work together. After the election, you and the President talked about getting together, improving your relationship. You suggested over a good glass of Merlot wine. But you told us the other day there has been, and you did this, zero outreach from the President. Are you disappointed?
No, he's been busy with a lot of things, and I think he realizes that we're going to have plenty of opportunities here in the coming weeks and months to get together.
You willing to play golf with him?
Of course.
Would you give him a handicap? He's not as good a golfer as you are.
I'm sure I'll have to give him strokes.
Serious subject. In the aftermath of the shooting in Tucson, Do you think that all members of Congress should have some form of security in town hall meetings or in Congress on your corner meetings when they're actually out in the public?
Well, we've worked with the Sergeant at Arms Office and the Capitol Police and all the members, outlining a lot of ideas and steps they can take to enhance the security for themselves and their staff. And I think a responsible way here is for members to follow those steps. There are a lot of things that could be done that don't require additional resources from the federal government that I think will, in fact, be helpful. But in cases where there are specific threats, clearly the Capitol Police, along with their partners, are willing to take steps necessary to protect the security of members and their staff. But
you told us in the breakfast we had that one of your colleagues in Congress had said it was just a matter of time. We're easy targets. Do you think as a default position when you're going to have an announced meeting, you know, I mean, there was no specific threat here with Gabby Giffords. It was simply she was meeting in a parking lot in a Safeway. Should, as a default position, should there be, whether it's local police or Capitol Police, should there be somebody there?
Well, I think every member will take steps to enhance their security. But I think it's also fair to say that even if there had been a protective detail there, we do not believe that would have stopped this particular incident from occurring. I mean, we have 535 members of Congress. What do we do every day? We're out in the public. We're out talking to our constituents. We're out talking to the American people. We have a very open society in America, and there is risk. There is risk with our job.
Finally, when I told people that I was going to be sitting down with you today...
I bet you got a lot of ideas.
No, I got one idea. A lot of them asked the same question. I wanted you to take a look at what happened during the State of the Union address.
That dream is why someone who began by sweeping the floors of his father's Cincinnati bar can preside as Speaker of the House in the greatest nation on earth.
Why do you cry so often?
You know, I feel pretty strongly about what I do. I didn't come to Washington to be a congressman. I came here to do something. And I don't need to be the Speaker of the House because I need some fancy title. I came here to do something on behalf of the American people. We got big challenges in America. And I feel very strongly about addressing them. And so I get emotional. Last night at the Alfalfa Club dinner,
which is, you should tell a big fancy dinner.
If it weren't for my emotions, I don't know if they had anything else to talk about last night.
You actually look like you're, I gotta say, you look like you're puddling up right now.
No, they handed me a box of tissues last night. You should have given me a box of tissues. I'll be ready for
Well,
this.
we thought about having them stacked all around the studio, but we thought you might not appreciate that. But look, I was surprised at how many people focused on this. But some of your supporters, strong conservatives, say it makes you look weak or strange.
Chris, you know me. I am who I am. I'm one of the most transparent people in this town. And yes, I wear my emotions on my sleeve. But I do feel strongly about it, and I'm not going to apologize for being emotionally attached to the things I feel most strongly about in this town.
And finally, and this was the other thing that people mentioned to me, funny, no issues, is they said, and I feel this way, we like you. Why don't you stop smoking?
Oh, why do we bring this up again? You know, smoking. Listen, it's a bad habit, but I have it. It's a legal product. I choose to smoke. Leave me alone.
Well, you know, on that basis, Mr. Speaker, we want to thank you so much for coming in today. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, sir. Please come back.
My pleasure.
I will leave you alone on smoking, but not on anything else.
Okay.
All right.